Woot. Now that we've all had a chance to get some sugar back into our systems, well, I haven't, but the rest of you have. I'd like to introduce John Quijada, I believe, whose primary claim to fame when he's not writing books about cognitive science or cognitive linguistics or quantum physics is inventing Ithgul, which is an interesting language.
It's one of the nicer things said about it.
For those of you who haven't perused his reference grammar, it's pretty, shall I say, complicated or complex? Both, I think. And I believe used to have basically the IPA chart plus some as its phonemic inventory. But I get the impression that that's being somewhat revised. Anyway, linguistics degree, etc., etc. Cool guy. Let's hear him talk.
Thank you. First thing I'd like to say, is this thing working? Hello? Hello?
No.
Test, test. Thank you. First thing I'd like to say to everyone is Q1 Onunukwa. Use some of those IPA extensions. Or to say the same thing the way Doug Ball would say it in Scare. Teris Kotnakwos. That is, hello, how are you all? I trust everyone's having a good time.
Yeah.
And I hope that all of you, as Sally Caves would put it, Remelf Galigilis. Get your tickling. That's Tianor's way of saying to have a blast. And I think I'd also agree with Christopher Hush when he says, Sek lonan oan perquiter, which is a nas for today is a lucky day. As you can see, I've taken some time to look at a few of your Conlangs, and all I can say is to quote from Sylvia Sotomayor's fascinating Kelen language, Vashazori Pashamar Vagi Yisho. There are no words for those wonders. And although there are some great Conlangs out there, there are a lot of others in need of a little help. Or as David Peterson would say in Sathir, Antwen Thutoya One Yoraur. Not every rock contains a gem. And that's why I'd like to talk to you this morning about what cognitive linguistics can do for you in your Conlang. But before I begin, I'd like to join Sally from this morning in offering my thanks to Sai Emeris for getting this off the ground. When I first heard about what he planned to do here, I thought that he must surely be insane.
Surely you haven't revised that notion.
Yes, as a matter of fact, when it comes to insanity, I now think that Sai is in a position to quote to me from Arthur Ngozie's Asha'il language, Yet dolor shavor leni ne koshirjie na chevni ne krines kashna. If you call me insane again, I'll eat your other eye. And some people think I'm weird for having examples about clowns. All right, let's talk about cognitive linguistics and Conlang. Let's go uncontrol this thing. What we're going to cover today is why you should know about cognitive linguistics, the specific concepts within cognitive linguistics that, or some concepts within cognitive linguistics that you can immediately apply to your own conlanging. What this presentation will not cover is we're not going to try and teach cognitive linguistics here today or present it as a coherent theory. We don't have time for that, and I'm not going to touch upon many of the aspects of cognitive linguistics that don't immediately, function as usable tools for you to apply to your conlang. So we're going to take a very practical, beginner's approach to getting some of these concepts quickly into your Conlang, and as far as using them as tools to modify what you've worked on. As far as the history and the basic premises behind cognitive linguistics, that's important information. I don't have time to present it right now, so I've, on page 37 of the program, I've spent a couple of pages providing you the briefest, barest, simplest version of the history and background and basic premises of cognitive linguistics. You might find it very interesting. So onward. Why? Why should we know about cognitive linguistics? First of all, it explores subconscious and semi-conscious areas of language that more formalist and traditional and Chomsky and etc. type grammars don't often, or sometimes just don't even touch or aren't even aware of. Cognitive linguistics raises those subconscious and semi-conscious structures of language to the conscious level, to a point where you can manipulate them and therefore have a better ability to avoid inadvertently creating language structures which covertly parallel English, or the structures of your native language if it's not English. This is especially important for languages like, say, Kele, in which one of its principles is to defy, linguistic universals. Well, you want to be sure you're doing that and not accidentally or inadvertently, still mirroring English at a semi-conscious or subconscious level. So it opens up a whole new level of creativity in Conlang design. What I think you're going to find, those of you who've got well-developed Conlangs, is that some of this stuff, about half of it, you're going to have already done by accident, just because of a natural intuitiveness about thinking outside the box of English, but maybe not systematically. And I'm going to give you the beginnings of some tools to do this systematically. So let's explore some cognitive linguistics. We're going to start with spatial conceptualization. A lot of what cognitive linguistics talks about and where it starts at is with the whole notion of spatial conceptualization. And this is because it starts with infancy, but at a pre-linguistic level, an infant is interacting with their environment through sensory motor, perception, interaction, bodily movement, tactile interaction with their toys. They're seeing things get carried around by their parents and guardians, and they're seeing things fall and move around. And what happens is this pre-linguistic fundamental knowledge of space, motion, and the senses becomes so ingrained, so understood at a pre-linguistic level that it becomes a foundation for structuring and understanding more abstract conceptual domains later. When cognitive linguists talk about spatial conceptualization, they use terms like landmarks, trajectories, and image schemas. So we're going to talk about what those are briefly. A landmark is an entity with respect to which some other entity moves. So it's the one that's not moving relative to something that is moving. The trajectory is the opposite. It's the one that's moving relative to something that is not moving. And when I say not moving, that's in a relative sense from the perspective of the trajectory. An image schema, a very important concept, is essentially it's a pattern based on our perceptions. That infant sees things like milk disappearing into objects, and that object then moving elsewhere, and then the milk appearing again, and begins to understand a concept. It's not really a concept, it's an image schema, it's preconceptual, called containment, or the container schema. And this becomes so ingrained and so fundamental, it later becomes used in reasoning when concepts begin forming. So it's a way of it's a primitive mental abstraction used in reasoning to associate percepts, what we perceive with our senses, associating them to concepts, things that we cognitively invent in our heads to explain what we're perceiving. Anyway, let's go on. Landmarks and trajectories we talked about. This gets pretty interesting in language. English is a good example of this because our use of prepositions in English maps to whether something is a landmark or a trajectory. So we have a situation where we have a stirrup on a horse, and we're going to put our foot into the stirrup, and I have another ring-like, round, circular-like metal device called a ring, and I put my finger it's going to insert into the same thing too. So why can we say we put feet into stirrups, but we don't generally say we put fingers into rings? Rather, we put rings on fingers. So if we say we put rings on fingers, why don't we put stirrups onto feet? And it's the whole thing of landmarks versus trajectories. Which is the one that's stationary from a conceptual, sensory motor-based, fundamental, subconscious way of thinking, versus which is the trajectory, which is the one that's moving. In the case of stirrups and rings, and the appendages that go with them, into them, they're opposite. Same thing with bulbs and sockets versus lids and jars. It's the exact same principle. An alien being with no conception of any of this would look at those two things happening, a lid being screwed onto a jar and a bulb being screwed into a socket, and say, same exact phenomenon. Why do you use different prepositions? Why do you say bulbs into sockets and lids onto jars? Why can't I put the jar on the lid? You know, if you can put the, and so it's this whole mapping of trajectories versus landmarks. You want to look at your Conlang and say, am I accidentally paralleling English? Do I want to switch around landmarks and trajectories? Do I want to ignore them and make it my language reflect a more meta level of connection between a ring-like object and a spiral groove pattern? Why not? Or if you're going to say, I want to do it like English, then why? You know, ask yourself these questions. I'm not going to tell you what the right answer is. That's for you to decide. You're the creator. But know what it is you're doing and know why you're doing it. That's the level of awareness about your Conlang I'm trying to raise in you today. Those image schemas, those preconceptual mental abstractions that infants develop. Here are some common ones that cognitive linguists have basically identified, that these are essentially concepts an infant already understands before they even begin learning language. The idea of containment, blockage, balance, counterforce, goal, path, goal, source, all of that stuff. And because these are so ingrained, these are going to map in various combinatorial ways to specific prepositions, phrases, and other words in a language that deal with spatial phenomena and other types of phenomena that relate to these. In English, to give you an example, let's take English in. In is a way of representing our most fundamental way of expressing the container schema, along with very often a center versus periphery schema, and sometimes a full versus empty schema. On the other hand, is your basic mapping to the surface schema with a little bit of counterforce schema thrown in because of the support against gravity, like a pen on a table, and possibly center periphery too, depending on the context. Because of image schemas, we're now able to explain in cognitive linguistics the usages of prepositions in languages in a way that is makes a lot more sense out of something that traditionally has been seen as nonsensical. You look at generative grammar, and try and find an explanation for why you use this preposition in this context and use a different one here. And it's arbitrary. They're just rules you've got to memorize. Well, cognitive linguistics can do better. So we talk about the sun is out, or the sun came out. What's the result? Can we see the sun? Yeah. Well, we say the light is out. Can we see the light? No. The fire went out. We're still using out. Yet, to achieve opposite ends. The sun comes out, I see the sun. When the fire goes out, I don't see the fire anymore. It's all opposite, even though we're using the same word. It must just be an arbitrary rule, right? Not at all. There's sense behind it. I'm going to show you it. Another thing that happens with prepositions, Tom filled in the form, Tom filled out the form. In and out, supposedly opposites, right? Why are opposites used to describe the exact same phenomena, same situation? Student dropped in this afternoon, student dropped out. Again, opposites now used to not convey opposite meanings, but utterly unrelated meanings. Big crowd turned up for the rally, big crowd turned out for the rally. Here we get an example where unrelated prepositions used to refer to the same exact situation. Traditionally, we've all thought of this, oh, these are just arbitrary, and in my language, I'll just, throw a dart at a dartboard to decide which one I use, right? Now we can do better than that. We can make sense of this through image schemas. On the top there, you see the basic representation of the image schema for out in English. The idea of the landmark, part that doesn't move, the trajectory either being or moving, this is static or dynamic, so that it is exterior to the landmark, having been interior, or implied as being interior, now exterior. That's basic image schema for landmark. Now let's map this to those sentences, the sun came out versus the fire went out. Notice that both sentences, even though they have exactly opposite results in terms of my being able to see the sun versus my being able to see the fire, notice that the schema is identical for both of them. The only difference is a matter of perspective of the observer. So with the sun came out, the perspective is with the trajectory. It has now entered my perceptual field because I'm there. But with the fire going out, my perspective is with the landmark, so that its being exterior now takes it away from my perceptual field. This is how a single image schema represented by a single word, out, can be used to apply to opposite situations or opposite perspectives. Pretty nifty. How's this going to relate to Conlang? Well, we'll get to that. Perspective on accessibility can be extended from the perceptual field to the cognitive field to describe more abstract situations. So remember the sun came out? We can take that idea of the perspective being with the trajectory, and instead of it entering my perceptual field, it can now enter my abstract cognitive field, thus allowing me to use out with situations like the news is out, the secret is out, the secret has come within or is now accessible to my cognitive field. She spoke out, her words are now accessible to my cognitive field. On the other side, the fire went out where the perspective is with the landmark. This can be extended to sentences like, the noise drowned me out, she blotted out the memory, he's hiding out. If he's hiding out, is he within my perceptual or cognitive field? No, because he's now exterior to the landmark. My perspective is from within the landmark. How is this going to relate to conlanging? Well, arbitrary usages of prepositions and particles are now explicable in ways you never thought of before, and so now you get to start making decisions on how you're going to manipulate all these kinds of things. So now things like Tom filled in the form and Tom filled out the form, which describe the exact same phenomenon using supposedly opposite prepositions, they're not using opposite prepositions per se. What they're using are different image schemas. So when you say Tom filled in the form, you are implying a container schema, so that you're seeing the form as a set of containers that can be filled in. Whereas Tom filled out the form, you're implying an additive schema, so that the form is something that is taking on more volume, or figuratively spreading out, because more information is being added to it. Totally different schemas reflected by different prepositions to describe the exact same physical, tangible phenomenon going on. Cool, huh? Think about how you're going to apply this to your Conlang. How are your prepositions mapped to your image schemas? Don't do them like English. You can have fun with this. So, should your Conlang speakers say fill in a form, or should they fill out a form? Or maybe something totally different. I can certainly think of fill up a form. Yeah. Spots on a vase or in a vase. In English, we get to do both. How about of a vase? Make it a genitive kind of schema, a belonging schema. Wrinkles on or in her skin. English allows both. Why? Because we can talk about wrinkles using two different image schemas as something that's a feature of a surface, like wrinkles in a bed sheet, or something that is imbued within a three-dimensional volume. Notice how cracks can't be in or on a surface. You can't have cracks on a surface in English. You put an asterisk in front of that example. But you can have cracks in a surface because cracks have a three-dimensional component, therefore it can't be applied to a two-dimensional context. Bubbles on or at the surface. English allows both. Why? Because we can look at bubbles from two different image schemas. The idea of simple location on the surface, on, or the path, source, goal schema, where a bubble at the surface has implicitly traveled a path from underneath the water, from underwater to the surface, so the word at maps to a point on a path. You'd say in your Conlang, how about in the surface? Same way that you can say a wrinkle in her skin. You want to determine what schema combinations can apply to various spatial and motion contexts and how they should map to your spatial temporal lexemes or morphology. I didn't know I was going to get a soundtrack. So representing schemas morphologically in your Conlang. So these image schemas are cognitively universal. All languages, because we're all human beings speaking languages, have a containment schema. But how they map to morphemes and lexemes is, morphosyntactic structures is language specific. So these then get extended to non-spatial, even very totally abstract concepts. That's why we can say in agony. Why can we say I am in agony? Because English allows us to think of agony via the container schema. So that being in agony or in love or agony is seen as a container that we can be in. How about being under love? Now that's going to strike you potentially as weird, right? But let's take a look at the Zapotec language and see what happens there. In Zapotec, the common... It's kind of cool because I'm kind of stretching the boundaries of your thinking. It's sort of nice to get a little sci-fi soundtrack. Baskets in Zapotec are the primary container, physical container that infants and children see in that culture. Well, it so happens that in the Zapotec culture, baskets are used equally to cover things up as they are to put things in. So you cover up the tortillas or the laundry or anything you don't want to get dirty. So infants see containers being used just as much to cover up things as they are to put things in. And guess what? The container schema maps equally to Zapotec's in lexicomorphology as it does to their under lexicomorphology. So now I don't know Zapotec. I don't know whether you can say I am under love in Zapotec, but it's probably a good candidate for being able to say it that way. And it explains why it wouldn't be an arbitrary use of the word under, because it's part of their container schema, which also includes covering things up. Pretty interesting, huh? Yeah. So think about what your con culture is going to use containers for, or other of those physical manifestations of those abstract schemas, and start mapping away to your spatial lexicomorphology, and leave English behind. Anyway, for alien non-humanoid conlangs, I don't know how many of you got conlangs being spoken by intelligent amoebas and things, but obviously this all came from, these image schemas are all coming from human sensory motor arrays and body symmetry. All right? So if you're not having a humanoid body, you're not going to have these image schemas. Or conversely, to say it conversely, if you do have these same image schemas in your language, you're not being a realist, you're not creating a realistic alien Conlang. So don't use Charon schemas if your speakers have circular radial symmetry with 360-degree vision, as opposed to bilateral symmetry front facing. Okay, different topic now. Let's talk about iconicity. Iconicity and a couple of topics we're going to look at now all deal with what's called construal. The idea that the same physical phenomena or situation can be construed in different ways, and we using things like different image schemas, and in this case, iconicity. Iconicity refers to the idea of using word order to convey something about a phenomenon or situation. So let's look at something called distance iconicity. I didn't give an example of this, but this is your good old ditransitive versus complement construction for the dative or indirect object in English. Take the sentence, I'm at a wedding, okay? I'm at a wedding, and take the sentence, I gave Sue a wedding gift. How many of you think that Sue's the bride by me saying that? All right. Do you have the same conception of her being the bride or not if I say instead, I give a wedding gift to Sue? No, because if you look at it in terms of case grammar, in Sue in the first sentence is the goal, whereas the in the second sentence she's merely a recipient. She's not necessarily. I can give a wedding gift to Sue if I have an armload of wedding gifts and I need someone to help me carry them to the table. And Sue's who I came with, so I could give a wedding gift to Sue to carry it. But if she's the bride, I'm more likely to give Sue a wedding gift. So even though Chomsky and company will tell you that those two sentences are semantically equivalent, in fact, they have different construals. They imply different things about what can be construed from them semantically. Iconicity does this. Resultative iconicity. We typically say in English, you put an adjective in front of a noun. I painted the white fence. But if we reverse it, I painted the fence white. We've used word order to create a different construal about the situation. Very different construal. In the first one, we know what, in the first sentence, 10a, we know what color the fence was previously before our painting it, right? We don't know what color it's going to be. Put the word white on the other side of the noun, everything switches around. Do we know what color the fence was? Haven't a clue. We know what color it's going to be, though. Resultative iconicity, using word order to put a whole different construal on the situation. From a completely omniscient third-party perspective, there's no difference between what happens. A person comes up and paints a fence, right? But we use these iconicity to provide different information about the same phenomenon. Sequential order iconicity. This is, I don't know if this is a linguistic universal. It may be. I it, try it, buy it versus buy it, I it, try it. Saying different things, right? Jane got married and had a baby. Now Chomsky and company are going to tell you that that's just a coordinate, coordinate clauses, so they can be broken down into two autonomous sentences. Jane got married, Jane had a baby, right? The two are just being connected into one sentence arbitrarily using the coordinative affix. But look what happens in terms of iconicity. Jane got married and had a baby means something different than Jane had a baby and got married, right? This has got social implications. Now, how did a coordinative clause develop social implications? This is what cognitive linguists talk about when we're talking about sequential order iconicity. The mere word order has implications well beyond, a diagram of a tree structure. So, application of all this stuff to conlanging. Well, examine your syntax. Have you inadvertently borrowed English iconicity patterns just because you assume that's the way language does it? Well, why does it have to do it that way? Ithquil, for example, doesn't have sequential order iconicity. It uses affixes, to indicate what's to be considered the first event in a sequence, or whatever. So that way you can put word order anywhere you want to. Consider to what extent these patterns are universal and can be applied and may be applied anyway. So if those of you who are going for natural style conlangs, if all languages do this, and yours is a natlang style conlang, well then you probably want yours to do this too. So I'm not saying avoid doing this. I'm just saying understand it so that you can make the choice as whether to do it or not. Consider morphology-based substitutes for instead have a resultative case instead of word order iconicity. White fence versus painting the fence white. You could get rid of that in terms of word order by having a case or something. Recipient versus goal marking. That would get rid of your ditransitive versus complement distinction. Different word order patterns, or use things like pitch and tone, prosodic elements to accomplish the same thing that simple word order does. This would be real convenient too in poetry, where word order becomes, you want it to be fairly flexible. Well, do you want it to be flexible at the consequence of losing meaning? No. So maybe you want to have morphological elements that are going to accomplish the same thing that word order was accomplishing. Lastly, on construal, I'm going to talk about perspective. Same situation described from two different perspectives equals different meanings. Look at sentence 13a and 13b. The path descends steeply into the valley versus the path climbs steeply out of the valley. Same path, right? Third-party omniscient viewer from an airplane above isn't seeing anything different about the path, whether I said a 13a or 13b, right? And I don't have to be at a certain location to say either one. I don't have to be standing at the bottom of the path to say the path just climbs steeply out of the valley. I can be at the top of the path and say the same thing. So this is not a matter of perspective of where I am. What I'm doing is using these different, and in English we accomplish perspective this way by different words. We use lexical differences to convey this. You might want to do morphological. Quijada does it that way, morphologically rather than lexical differences, but that's up to you. But anyway, I'm saying something about the path in 13a that's different from what I'm saying in 13b. The implication in 13a is what? That someone's going to have to climb down, versus 13b, that somebody's going to have to climb up, right? So how do you want to do this in your language? You want to make it formalized in totally the same way as English, using different lexical choices? Certainly okay. Or you might want to think, maybe I should have perspectivizer affixes, things like that. John bought the car from Mary, Mary sold the car to John. Buy versus sell, lead versus follow. The complementary pairs go on and on. Nobody can lead anyone unless someone's following, right? So, do we want to have different lexemes? Do we want to have one lexeme that has perspectivizer morphology attached to it? The pen is on the table is under the pen. Why not? Not in English, because pragmatic elements enter the picture, but if you're an alien language or something, then flies can be, instead of flies on the ceiling, which from a Chomskyan point of view doesn't really make sense, it should be fly under the ceiling, right? Because it is, but we don't say that. Well, maybe your language you might want to say, flies are under ceilings, because you're looking at it from a purely spatial context. So consider whether to formally represent perspective morphosyntactically. Should you use different verbal voices, perspectivizer affixes, prosodic changes? Do this with a lexicon the way English and other Western languages do it. Remember, perspective we saw once before in its relationship to image schemas. Remember, the sun is out versus the fire is out, and that was a perspective difference. Just like what we're implying with the path climbing steeply versus descending steeply. Alien conlangs, for those of you with extraterrestrial speakers, why stop at a binary point of view? Why not let tables be under the pens? That sort of thing. Okay, let's go to a new topic, big one here, conceptual metaphor. Arguably the most, well, I think certainly the most fun part of applying cognitive linguistics to a Conlang. This all started with George Lakoff's and Mark Johnson's book in 1980, Metaphors We Live By. Their premise is simple. The implications are profound. They're saying that human beings structure their understanding of their experiences in the world via conceptual metaphors. These are derived from the basic sensory, motor, and spatial concepts learned during infancy and early childhood. We already talked about that. This is learned via interaction with the external environment. The process is largely subconscious. These simpler, more basic concepts are used as a framework for conceptualizing more abstract experiences and situations. Take a look at page 40 of the book, and you'll see examples of this in English. This is pervasive. We're not just talking idioms. We're talking about the way we talk about things naturally. So look at the first one, about north is up, south is down, east is back, west is out. I'm moving up north, right? Now, if someone were just hit you with that cold and say, is there an idiom involved? You'd say, no, you're just moving up north. you have to consciously think about the fact that, wait a minute, there is no relationship between upward, i.e. skyward motion, and northward motion on the surface area. No relationship whatsoever. It is a metaphor. But it is so ingrained into the way we think about, talk about the cardinal directions that we've lost sight that there's a metaphor involved. It's become semi-conscious. You have to be reminded of it the way I'm doing now. This goes on and on and on in language. English, hundreds of these metaphors, metaphorical domains, I should say, have been identified. Lots of which, or several of which I've put here. States or shapes. You know, I'm out of shape. Prison reformed me. Prison reformed me. No one would think at first blush that there's any kind of metaphor involved. That's the word you use to talk about, you know, rehabilitation in prison. But like, reform, like I got a clay thing that I'm forming here. You know? And so it's a metaphorical way of looking at the world. Obviously, some of you are probably already saying, hey, wait a minute, this kind of on its face proves the weak version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, you know, which I won't argue with you. Anyway, these metaphors are language specific, or at least language families specific. Some of them overlap with non-Indo-European languages. Japanese, by the way, for being as, you know, very distant from any Indo-European kind of way of looking at things, interestingly enough, uses a lot of the same conceptual metaphors as English, you know, but, and well as other languages don't. Seeing is touching, eyes are limbs. I can't take my eyes off her. I can pick out every detail. He ran his eyes over her body. Life is a gambling game. I'll take my chances. Here's an example from Italian. I've got Italian on the brain these days because I've been, my last 2 vacations have been to Italy. So, yeah, it's probably the foreign language that I speak best at the moment. So I use that as an example. Quanto ne abbiamo? How many of them do we have? If you say that in Italy to a native Italian speaker, he's going to look at a calendar or his watch and say, oh, today he's going to tell me in Italian, we have 23 of them. Because today is the 23rd. Because Italian has a conceptual metaphor that days on a calendar are a collection of countable objects. And that's a way of saying, we don't have that one in English, but as you can see, they're language specific. So, some of you are really creative. I mean, this part of your Conlang and con culture, the subjective metaphorical part, the psyche of your speakers is extremely important. Let's look at like a language like Teonath with you know, it's not just a language. There's a world there and a way of being if you were a Teonath speaker in this world. What conceptual metaphors are they going to use? Are they going to count calendars as countable objects? You know, how would they refer to asking for the day? Would they have a conceptual metaphor associated with it? We already saw one where getting a kick out of things is getting your tickling, you know? Pretty cool, huh? I like that one. Anyway.
You get a lot of things. You are passive and things happen.
Okay. And that would probably have a lot of implications in terms of what conceptual metaphors are going to feel natural in using. Don't use English ones, you know, unless you want to. So lots of examples. These conceptual metaphors can get pretty fundamental, probably down to the universal level in certain aspects. One way is based on body symmetry, orientation, sensory motor interaction. Because infants and children, once they begin mapping their schemas to actual words and language, because we are frontward facing, stand upright, we do things rather than sit around, we conceive of applying our notions of good and bad to ourselves, we occupy a particular physical space and a particular time, we metaphorically come to conceive ourselves and other canonical persons as being up front, active, good, here and now. And bad people or other, you know, aliens, enemies as being, or enemy or adverse things in the world, whether people or not, as being down, back, passive, bad, there, and then, right? These probably are approaching universals. So you don't want to violate these metaphors if you're doing an Atlang style Conlang, all right? For non-humanoid con cultures and languages, once again, before you start talking about, I'm feeling up today, if your body symmetry of your speakers is a horizontally based crab, 6 feet long and only a foot off the ground, they don't conceive themselves as being canonically up. All right? So you're not likely to have this metaphor in this conceptual metaphor as a basis for talking about feeling up, things are looking up today. They're not, or if you were going to have it, then you're being unrealistic in your alien Conlang. See what I mean? So think about these things. All right. A lot of conceptual metaphors are specific instances of more general metaphors, and the general metaphors that have been mapped out for English or have been stated for English are basically these. States are locations, changes are movements, causes are forces, actions are self-propelled movements, purposes are destinations, action is directed motion. It impacts speech, but not just that, it impacts how we think about situations. They are powerful rhetorical devices for social manipulation. Lakoff talks about this a lot in one of his books, the way that taxes get talked about, the way that the conceptual metaphors used by the government in publications talking about nuclear energy. They manipulate these conceptual metaphors all over the place. And because these things operate semi to subconsciously, you're just being spun like a top when you read this stuff. Okay. So when you're translating from English into your Conlang, before you start saying, oh gosh, I'm going to translate, I'm crazy about her. Okay, what's my word for crazy? Stop! Just because love is madness is a conceptual metaphor in English, why does it have to be in your language? Why don't we make it love is dancing in your language? So you say, God, she makes me jitterbug, something like that. Which would be the same way of saying it in your language, and just as natural a way of saying it, So, okay, let's see. Think of metaphors whose underlying conceptual logic matches your con culture or the psyche of your speakers, which is what I was saying. There's a love is dancing metaphor. I just made these up. Anger is a hospital, So instead of saying anger is a hospital. In English, we speak of anger in several different conceptual metaphors. One is heat from a liquid. So you say, I'm at my boiling point, or I'm ready to blow my top, a sort of a hot heat pressure liquid under pressure metaphor. Oh, well, maybe anger is a hospital in your language. It's like, take me into the emergency room, And that would be the natural way of saying it. We're not talking about an idiomatic construction. It'd be the way that people say, I'm ready to blow my top, So when you're writing dialogue for short stories in your Conlang, this is the kind of thing you want to be thinking about. What are your conceptual metaphors? Life is music, Hey, I'm these days I'm living my adagio, Sex is art. Boy, that was a real Jackson Pollock lesson. So, in terms of what you can do with creativity here in your Conlang is unbounded. Go at it. This stuff's fun. Okay, in fact, it's going to be a lot more fun for you than it is for me with Quijada, because I don't get to use these sorts of things, being a philosophical language. My new language that I'm working on does, because I'm going back to art language, but it's going to be a while before anyone sees anything. Anyway, categorization and prototypes. I'll try and rush through this. Human categorization schemes are arbitrary. They're also based on fuzzy logic, not classical set theory. This is important. We tend to think of things in categories as any member of a category functions as an equal and sufficient example of that category. And in fact, categories aren't this way at all in the real world. Categorization schemes utilize prototypes. Membership is relative to a best example. And you've got radial categories like Wittgenstein's Spiel, game, where there is no prototype. No particular example contains, necessary and sufficient conditions that are contained by any other member. So as far as game is concerned, what does bowling have to do with poker, have to do with hide and seek? where are the common elements? If you say the only common element is recreation, well, where's the recreation when then, someone says, stop playing games with me? We're not talking about recreation anymore. So this is a radial category where we've got basically family resemblances. A good example of a radial category in a totally different context that most people understand is like a dialect chain. Look at the Inuit languages coming from Alaska all the way to Greenland. All right? Community A over here can understand community B, who understands community C. C, however, has trouble with it understanding A. A cannot understand D at all, but C talks to D just fine. Which one's the standard language? Which one's the best example of Inuit? There is none. It's all family resemblances. This is what's called a radial category. Fruit, ask people, give me an example of fruit. You're going to say things like apples and oranges. Are you going to say things like dates? Are you going to say things like tomato? Almost certainly not. Why? Most of us put tomato in the vegetable category, even though genetically it's a fruit. So you got extreme examples, a lot of research in this area. So in linguistic morphology, this whole idea of gradient categories we find it all over the place. Look at the suffix able as in washable, able to be washed, able to be X'd. Well, in that case, drinkable should mean able to be drunk. Well, people, hydrochloric acid is able to be drunk. Does that make it drinkable? No. There's an example of where the able suffix is not being used in its prototypical meaning. It's off here somewhere. And a readable book is not a book that can be read. It's one that's easy to read. Why the difference in the meaning? Why the semantic shift? It's a pragmatic issue. Readable book, meaning able to be read, is a near tautology. What do you even need to talk about readable books for? Any book, by definition of a book, can be read. So therefore, let's use the word readable to mean something a little bit more salient in terms of the real world. Just like in the diminutive in Romance languages, where you get like Italian paesino from paese, a small village versus, as opposed to a village. Cenetta, cena is supper. Cenetta, what does that mean? A little miniature supper? No, it's a light supper. Dormicchiare, from dormire, to sleep. Well, dormicchiare, a little sleep? What is a little in size? Sleep it has no meaning, so it means to snooze. So you begin to see the extension abstractly as to how a canonical category like the diminutive can be applied to pragmatic context. Once again, we've got room for creativity here in your Conlang. So so what's going to be the semantic range of a particular morphological category? Maybe the diminutive in your language might be used to say things like speak plus diminutive is to speak inanities rather than to speak small, tiny words. Or to tell a falsehood rather than, small, tiny words. I mean, go at it in terms of creativity as far as what the semantic range is of your category. Consider whether the particular worldview or psychology or culture warrants a different categorization scheme as far as the boundaries or constraints. Verb tenses and aspects. Sai came up with an idea, we exchanged some emails. He was saying, hey, tenses were referring to circular time, based on the particular, worldview of your culture. A tense that means something happened once and will happen again. It isn't happening now. Wouldn't that be cool if, in fact, circular, cyclic worldview, time was part of your culture? It goes on and on. Semantic taxonomies, bird. Okay, what's the canonical bird? You're going to look at a sparrow or a robin. You're going to say a penguin is the prototypical example, or an ostrich. Well, imagine a Conlang or a culture where the ostrich is the canonical bird, and robins and sparrows are the extreme example. You can play with it.
Short-necked flying bird.
Large gray animal with tube-like appendages. Okay, last topic. Do I have time for this side? Okay. Frame semantics. A lot of fun here, too. This one's a little hard to explain. Maybe we can get Dr. Fillmore here on campus. Is he still here? I guess he's a emeritus.
I actually don't know. But yeah, he's definitely from here.
Back in 1968, Charles Fillmore here on this campus basically wrote the first paper that invented frame semantics and several others. Anyway, given word goes well beyond its dictionary definition. And so if you're thinking of words for your Conlang and being satisfied that you've got it nailed just by having a dictionary definition, you've forgotten all about the frame in which these things operate. So let's take a word like eat. Eat, you can say ingest nourishment, or ingest solid nourishment and be done with it. But the word eat, at least in English, conveys automatically and subconsciously an entire range of other concepts that become subconsciously immediately available for use and implication by both you and your listener, assuming your listener is another English speaker. So when I say eat, automatically I have immediate subconscious access to food, silverware, kitchens, cooking, ovens, cups and plates, menus, restaurants, hunger, famine, so that now I can make reference, or even an anaphoric reference to these other concepts and be understood. Metonymy is a good example, or is one fringe element of frame semantics. So metonymy is when you substitute one concept for another that logically doesn't make sense. The White House has announced that we're nuking Iran, right? Well, a white painted piece of architecture at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in DC did not make a decision. It's an inanimate object.
How about the White House?
But you know what I mean, because you know what, when I say the White House, what I'm referring to. I'm substituting one concept for another. That's metonymy. That you'll find Tolkien on the top shelf there. I thought he died in 1973, right? But that's metonymy. Why is it understood? Why, when I say Tolkien's on the top shelf, why do you understand what it means without me having to explain I don't mean his dead body? Because you have immediate access to the frame of what the word Tolkien and shelf means, because it conveys all these other concepts. How is this stuff learned? Cultural interaction, which is why new English speakers of English, often make such funny mistakes, because they don't have the frames figured out, or they're using wrong frames, or and you make assumptions about their understanding of the frame, you can get yourselves all mixed up. So your frames can, the boundaries of your frames are what get interesting for Conlang, as to what shall be included in the boundary. We can probably skip this line. Here's an example of frames, gives you some of the subtle implications of frame. Why are bachelor and spinster not co-equivalent words in terms of some kind of feature-based way of doing semantics? Right? Is a bachelor plus male plus adult minus married, and that's a bachelor? Okay, so is the Pope a bachelor? Is Tarzan a bachelor? Is a gay man living with his longtime boyfriend a bachelor? Fuzzy categories again. There's no feature-based binary logic plus minus operating. Leave that for Chomsky and company. That's a nice mathematical way of looking at a model of language, but it's not how people make sense of the world and think and talk. So cognitive linguistics is more about that, and it has implications. So frames connote an entire network of cultural information. This is an excellent opportunity for integration with your culture. The fake gun thing, this is a little one hard to understand. I don't know if we need to go into this one. The killing frame. Okay, in English, the killing frame, if you go to FrameNet, the FrameNet website, which is Fillmore's website, where he lists a whole bunch of English frames, you'll find that for the killing frame entails, if I say I killed something or killed someone, it entails automatically a cause of death, an instrument, a method, a perpetrator, a victim, a degree, a manner, a place, a purpose, a reason, a result. Purpose is the, if I recall the definition of what he means by that, purpose is the outcome desired after the killing, versus reason, which is the reason going in to doing the killing, the conditions that gave rise to wanting to kill. So, well, you could have the killing frame in your Conlang be more culturally sensitive to your culture. Maybe killing in certain aspects of your history or culture has certain ritualistic elements, so that certain articles of clothing are associated with the frame. or certain instruments, or I think I give an example in the next slide. Yeah, I thought of the idea of let's add body part to the killing frame in a Conlang so that I can now say sentences like, I throated him to death, meaning I killed him. The paraphrase in English would be, I killed him in a way that involved his throat. It was something I did to his throat is what caused his death. We can't say that in English, I throated him. Well, but if body part is part of the killing frame in your Conlang, such a sentence will make sense. You see what I mean? Expand the boundaries of your frames, or take off elements that are in English frames so that you can semantically shift your words to a personal way of looking at the world. Business, commerce, romantic relationships, food, family, education, politics, transportation. These are conceptual domains that are ripe for manipulating their frame, fine-tuning it to your con culture. Questions?
For what it's worth, I want to say we're running slightly short, so I'm going to say 5 minutes, that's it, for questions right now. But I'm sure that when you have time to mull it over lunch, which is going to be coming up in a few minutes, that you'll have many more questions to ask him that you can save for afterwards. Anyone has some short questions?
Just one stick. Oh, sorry.
Do you have any advice, say we've thought about all these different things, for documenting it online, say?
Actually, this presentation is a reworking of a series of posts that I had put up on the Zompist bulletin board, which one of the other members on there has encapsulated it all into a new linguistics, Conlinguistics wiki that he's put together. And I don't have the URL with me, but if you go to the Zompist site, if you know where that is, they've got a new forum there called Language and Linguistics Museum, or L&L Museum. One of the topics there is a cognitive linguistics thread. That's the one I wrote. If you go to the very last, or at least currently last post in that thread, it's by this person who created the wiki that I'm talking about. He took all the elements of the lessons within that thread and consolidated them all on one page. It's basically an expanded and slightly different version of this whole presentation. You'll see it all there explained in a narrative fashion.
Can we have one more short question?
First.
Right, I was wondering if these various different things, especially the frame semantics, could impact how various cultures in the world, including ours, is able to conceptualize, like, say, scientific concepts. And
let me give you a great example, because Lakoff wrote a whole book about it recently, in which he, and I'm not going to get into politics here, but his own politics are fairly well known. So he talks about one of the reasons that the Democratic Party in this country can't get anywhere in fighting the current administration, the current Republican Party's control of the public thinking regarding to issues like taxation, for example, is because the Republicans have co-opted the tax frame in American English by equating it with relief, the relief frame. So we talk about tax relief, right? And by putting those two together, they've recreated the boundaries of the tax frame. So now it's impossible at a conscious level in America for a lot of people to think of tax without thinking also of the relief frame, so that it's a burden to be removed or whatever. And unfortunately, according to Lakoff, the Democrats have bought into it, hook, line, and sinker, instead of creating their own frame. And that's why they can't get anywhere with changing the way taxes are discussed in this country. And he suggests Democrats should learn frame semantics so that they can then create a new frame in the media, such as tax responsibility. So that, and then they would begin publishing articles about the fact that, hey Joe, you didn't build the roads, yet you use them. Doesn't that imply a responsibility on your part, and your moral duty as such, and the way of thanking or showing gratitude to those who built the roads is to pay a fee for their use. We'll call that a tax. See, so redefine the frame of one being tax responsibility instead of tax relief. So he wrote a whole book about how frames can be used to manipulate, in the people's thinking, in the media, in, you name the.
What's this author again?
George Lakoff, L-A-K-O-F-F. Yeah. That particular book is called.
Don't think of an elephant.
Yeah, Don't Think of an Elephant. Thank you. Moral politics is like a beefier version of the same premise.
I think that's actually a pretty good place to leave off for now. Before we break for lunch, I do have a few announcements to make. Yeah, so first off, as an organizational thing, which is after this, there's a quote-unquote after party. What that translates to is anyone who's interested in this comes with us to Long Life Veggie House, which is like a few blocks away. It's a pretty good vegetarian Chinese restaurant. And they're going to call me in half an hour and ask how many people are going to show up. So could I have a show of hands of how many people are interested in going? Or likely to go?
Reasonably committed.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 or so. Okay, so I'll have them reserve one space for that. So two other things. Something I announced online, but I don't know if all of you happen to notice. One of the speakers that I invited to come and who was initially very interested in the conference, she's always booked up many months in advance, is Suzette Haddon Elligan. We were planning on maybe having a sort of telepresence thing where she could give a talk via video conference or via video, but that didn't really work out. But what she did send in is this. First Dictionary and Grammar of Latin, which some of you may be familiar with by repute, plus